Liberal candidate Lee Jae-myung is a strong favorite to become South Korea's next president. But criminal trials hang like the sword of Damocles over his political career. This is the pilot episode of By Ballots or Bailiffs. Hello and welcome. My name is Peter. If the rest of you would introduce yourselves.
My name's June.
My name's Rudy.
And we're here today to debut this weird idea that I've been kicking around for a while that I got these two roped into, is about the criminal trials of political leaders in democracies and their consequences. So, without further ado, I think we should start on our first episode. So, the candidate in question is Lee Jae-myung. It is Lee, if you are American. I'm going to pronounce it Lee Jae-myung, so I sound like I know what I'm talking about. I will start a little bit. He is the current leader of the Democratic Party of Korea. If you've been paying any attention to the news in South Korea, you would understand that it's been a little bit tumultuous. They've had their president impeached. They've had their acting president impeached. And we'll get to that in just a second. I will briefly introduce Lee, referred to by his first name. He was born in 1963. He became a lawyer, apparently thanks to attending a lecture by later president in 2002, Roh Moo-hyun. He was a failed candidate in a few by-elections afterward. He got his big break once he ran for the mayor of the city of Seongnam in 2014. He won that. He became a well-known figure within the country at that period. In 2018, he ran to be the governor of what I believe is South Korea's largest province. Is that correct?
Yep.
In Gyeonggi-do. I think I've pronounced that correctly. He won what I believe was a fairly close race that time in 2018. Even then, he was being dogged by accusations that he had committed a crime. He really had a tumultuous career in his time as governor. He started out with a very low approval rating. He had to fight accusations that he'd had an affair with an actress. But he was able to recover his career somewhat during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So his approval ratings went from, I believe, about 30% to about 70% in that period of time. And from there, in 2017, he made a brief run for the presidency thanks to his statements at rallies advocating for the impeachment of conservative President Park Geun-hye. The statement, he said, he believed that Park Geun-hye has no right to be president of the country. He experienced a brief boomlet period in the polls, reaching somewhere about 25 to 30%. However, he ended up losing in the primary to who eventually won the election, candidate Moon Jae-in. And from there, he was still governor of Gyeonggi-do at that point. However, he was able to finally overcome, and this is where I will get into his criminal investigations in just a second, the forced hospitalization of his brother. He was indicted under the Public Official Election Act. However, with all of that being said, he would become leader of the Democratic Party of Korea in 2022 after the presidential election that he lost to candidate and now president Yoon Suk-yeol. We will touch briefly upon the impeachment saga. If you've been living under a rock for the last, 2 months, the president tried to declare martial law. He was impeached, he was arrested, and he now faces both criminal trials and an impeachment trial, which will, should he be convicted, lead to a presidential election that Lee would, everyone is certain, he hasn't stated it yet, but one that he would run in. I'll let the two of them sort of come into this. I'll let Rudy and Jiwon come in on the impeachment trial. If you could give us a little more details about his impeachment trial, just a little bit.
Like with relation to Lee, or just in general?
With relation to Lee and in general. I'll let the two of them speak. I've been speaking for a bit here.
Well, I mean, you do see Lee get this boom in his votes during times of chaos in the Korean government. Like in the impeachment of, currently Yoon and impeachment of Park, he's always the front man of the crowd coming up and saying, I will fix the country if you can elect me. I will do this, I will do that. and he gets a lot of media exposure during these times. And I must say, Lee is an interesting character. As
Mysterious. one would say.
mysterious. I mean, he does come up in his Instagram live of him jumping the fence to the National Assembly.
Very well
So,
known at this point.
Yes, and we haven't. I don't believe historically that any politician have jumped the fence to go to a national parliament.
Yeah. The Speaker of the National Assembly did it as well, but yeah.
Yeah.
It was just an extremely extraordinary instance, which really did redound to Lee's benefit because, as we will talk about in a second, he is under indictment for 5 different cases, 6 cases. 2 of them were merged into one case. And although he had some success in the 2024 parliamentary elections, should he have been convicted in these cases, he would be finished as a candidate. So, Lee, as we said, is a mysterious character, and although he has attempted to create an image of him being an anti-corruption crusader, I believe when he was mayor of Gyeonggi-do, he had attempted to install cameras into his office because he said there were people that were always coming in with envelopes of cash. Unfortunately for Lee, he has been under extreme legal stress, I could put it that way. And this started pretty early on in his career. In 2002, he was convicted of impersonating a prosecutor. Apparently, he was a lawyer at the time. He was trying to call a member of the media, and in order to get more information, he had posed himself as a prosecutor on this call. He was convicted. That wasn't even the end of that case. It's mentioned later on in a current trial that he faces. In 2004, he was booked for the crime that I think a lot of politicians have been caught on, which was simply he was driving under the influence. I believe he blew a .15 on it. I'm not quite sure what the status of his drinking is now, but it's a minor offense, but one he got caught on. In 2004, now, if anybody knows more about this one, you can chime in. I believe when he was a lawyer, a case that he was litigating had a swift conviction, and the people that he was representing in the room that they were inhabiting had destroyed a bunch of property. Whether Lee had also done that himself, I'm not quite sure. This was around also the time of the DUI. And in 2010, he was convicted of violating the Public Official Election Act, which we will discuss later. He was caught illegally distributing campaign material in 2010 when he was running for local office in Seongnam. Under the Public Official Election Act, it is illegal to be distributing campaign materials such as pamphlets in large centers such as the subway, which is, I believe, where he was distributing them. And then where he ran into some trouble in his when he was mayor of Gyeonggi-do was for the forced hospitalization of his brother. Now, the context of that is that Lee Jae-myung's younger brother, was it his younger brother?
I believe so.
Yeah, his younger brother was hospitalized, put in a hospital, a mental institution, essentially, according to Lee, for harassing and abusing his mother and his sister. During a debate in 2018, during this campaign for to be Gyeonggi-do governor, Ji-won, you might be able to get more into this. It was a minor party candidate who started accusing Lee of a whole number of offenses, including having an affair with an actress, which we haven't gotten into yet either, which we could probably just touch on briefly. But if you want to speak to that.
Well, Peter, I mean, with all the cases that you've sort of described currently, we can see that Lee he works in a legal field without being legal. What he does is, whatever his goal is to do, he will get to it without having any legal or ethical boundaries. And I think that's what makes him so successful as a politician in Korea currently. And this plays as, I guess, a factor in viewing Lee and his current bigger chunks of the cases that's happening currently.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about the forced hospitalization of his brother is that in Korea, it is actually legal for a family member to force hospitalization of a direct family member if they believe that they do have a psychological problem. And psychological problems are a very relative thing in a sense. But like you mentioned, Lee does get accused of a lot of things that are sort of on the gray line. It's hard to prove that he did it, but with his previous records and how he runs his things, it is quite feasible that he has done those things. But they're all with very, I'd say, it's evidences with that lack a certain part of it, like a witness who believes that they remember such moment, but then a follow-up evidence from Lee would show that the moment actually didn't happen on the certain date that the witness said, but happened the day previous. And so it happened, but some of the puzzle pieces just don't fit, right? And that's how it goes for Lee. And so, yeah, I think can't really describe much more of the events on the gray line, as he's not really accused of it. And I do not want to sound like I'm trying to accuse him of such things.
Yeah. We don't want to get involved in any libel or slander.
Yeah.
At least yet. I will say, yeah, in the case of the forced hospitalization of his brother, I want to dwell on this for a second just because it was an important case. And again, correct me on this, if he was convicted of this case, his election as governor, which I believe was a close election, would have been nullified if he was found guilty in this case. He was charged under the Public Official Election Act for false facts. He claimed that he did not try to get his brother hospitalized or didn't pressure members of this hospital to send his brother off to this mental institution. He was also he was charged with abuse of power in forcing the members of this hospital to send his brother off to the hospital. And his brother also, I believe, died recently. This is also a pattern with Lee of having witnesses in his cases, of which there are many, die. We'll see that in a second with Kim Moon-ki. Luckily for Lee, although I believe he was convicted in one of the first two trials, he was acquitted by the Supreme Court, and I think it was a 7-5 ruling, close ruling. But they determined that in this case, due to the nature of what was said, you couldn't prove one way or the other whether Lee had actually illegally abused his power by trying to get his brother hospitalized. I think the justices admitted that there may have been some undue influence, but nothing that rose to the level of illegality. And in the case of the actual statement that he made, it is difficult to get convicted under the Public Official Election Act for cases that are made during a debate, in the cut and thrust of a debate. Saying something spontaneously in response to something would not fall under the Public Official Election Act. So now I think I want to get into the 5 different cases that Lee finds himself under trial for. We will focus more on the Kim Moon-ki case because this is the case for which has been running parallel. They've all been running parallel, but has been running parallel to Yoon's impeachment trial and is the one where he faces the most significant judicial risk is the term that is used, translated from Korean to English, judicial risk for Lee.
This is basically the case that will decide whether he has a chance of running for the next presidency. So,
yeah, I think that's what makes probably specifically Korean politics kind of more special, even with regard to the subject of the podcast in general, in that often it is a judicial outcome that affects political outcomes so very much. So especially for this one, the outcome of Yoon's trial, which we're not covering now, but the outcome of that one and the outcome of Lee's trial will completely decide who is going to be running. And so,
yeah, it will decide the next presidential election, and this has been true for anybody who has past knowledge of this. It's somewhat well known that presidents in South Korea have a history of, after leaving office, of getting indicted, of getting charged, of going to jail in the cases of Lee Mun-bak and Park Geun-hye, or committing suicide to avoid a trial. This happened in the case of Roh Moo-hyun who was president from 2002 to 2007, who was apparently the inspiration for Lee to run for office. So it's a trend. It's the judicialization of politics, the politicization of justice. We'll get into that in a little bit. I want to start with now the case that brings the greatest danger to Lee. So, Jian, if you could just briefly mention Kim Moon-ki, what he was doing with this development scandal, Daejeongdong, and maybe a little bit about Lee's business trip to Australia, one that I think that he regrets now, but I'll let you speak on it.
Well, how about we start on the Daejeongdong case itself, which was already done with the crime being blamed on another member of Lee. So basically, what happened while Lee was the mayor of Seongnam was that he was accused of privileging certain companies of the apartment sales. And apartment sales in Korea, it's pretty beneficial. I mean, they're financially stable, and if you know the apartment bubble in Korea currently, it's quite high. And so what ends up, and actually I'll talk about Kim Moon-ki's role here. And Kim Moon-ki was working as one of the he was one of the directors that was relevant to the case in Seongnam. So basically he was part of the strategy team of buying these lands for the apartment and practically building the apartments there. And they were accused of, sorry, the word is in Korean, but so they were accused of privileging the company that Kim Moon-ki was a part of. And what ends up happening is, in the actual trial, it's instead of Lee, it is Kim Young, who's the vice president of Institution for Democracy, and also a close member to Lee, that gets blamed for the crime, and he is accused of that case. And I believe he's facing nearly 8 years. I mean, this is very approximate, but it's around 8 years. But then important fact that we need to see here is that on the judgment paper itself, which is around 150 pages long, Lee's name is mentioned over 130 times, which makes Lee a crucial member of this case, yet he does not face any crime. And now we come to our status quo of Kim Moon-ki.
Yeah, I will discuss her. So, with all of that being said, this actual case does not accuse Lee of any impropriety in the Daejeongdong development scandal. It simply accuses Lee of lying. So I'll set the background for you. In 2015, when Lee was mayor of Seongnam, he goes on this business trip to I believe it was Australia. And he is there, I believe, to make do some inspections of the Australian tram system, of the subway system, just to sort of see how this could be modeled in South Korea in the city of Seongnam. So he goes there with around 9 or 10 different people. Some of these are low-level officials. One of them is Kim Moon-ki. And so after the fact, while this whole scandal erupts over Lee's statements, which I'll get into in a second, Kim's family releases these photographs and videos of Lee being, he's close with Kim, because remember, this is a business trip of about 9 or 10 people, of being close with him, of sort of being next to him, but not like talking with him or speaking with him. So it's not exactly clear what the relationship between the two is at this point. And there is also a very famous photograph, which I will get to in a second. But the first statement that is made, so since Kim is embroiled in controversy regarding Daejeongdong, he is asked on December 22nd, 2021, which is the day after Kim is found to have committed suicide. The body was found, I believe he hung himself by a noose. I'm not sure why that's particularly relevant, but on December 22nd, he is asked in an interview on SBS, which is a Korean TV station, did you know director Kim personally while you were mayor of Seongnam? These are translations from Korean, so it's not direct, but it'll, I think, be helpful to have them read out. The candidate answered, "I did not know him when I was the mayor because he was a low-ranking employee." Lee then says, during the trial at the time, which is a trial he faced in 2018 over Dae Jang-dong, Director Kim was the one who mainly informed me of the details because I did not know anything about them. And I learned of this person's existence when I was put on trial as the governor of Gyeonggi-do province, and I called him quite a few times. So after the business trip. And then on December 29th, Lee makes another statement in an interview at sort of a town hall style meeting. I believe it was on, I don't remember the exact station off the top of my head. But a few days after this December 22nd statement, the PPP obtains photographs of Lee playing golf with Kim. And when we say playing golf, it appears to be a photo of them either before or after they've actually went golfing. You can see the city skyline in the background of, I don't remember the city off the top of my head. But it's a picture of four people. Lee is there in sunglasses and a hat. And behind him is Kim Moon-gi. Now, Lee is not so happy with this. He says in a statement on December 29th, "The People Power Party released a photo as if I played golf. But when I checked, I found that they'd taken part of a group photo and showed it. It was manipulated." Now, again, that is translated from Korean. What Lee is accusing the PPP of in this instance is of cropping the photo. Now, this gets to the heart of the case because this was the one charge that I believe Lee was actually convicted on, which is claiming that the photo was manipulated. And there was an extensive back and forth on this over the trial. What does the word manipulation mean? If either one of you want to jump in on that, if you have any more knowledge of that.
Well, this is sort of Lee's wordplay so that in order for him to, I guess, delay the trial or to gain more possibilities of him actually winning the trial, because when you say manipulation, I think he used that word specifically so that he can deny the photo. But at the end, what happens is that he doesn't actually deny the truth behind it. He just says that, no, it's just I have the problem with the photo. I don't say anything about the event itself. So we sort of see him use manipulation as, I guess, his excuse, because we don't usually say manipulation on an evidence because it was cropped of a bigger photo. We usually say it was manipulated when we see, I guess, a change from its actual...
Like Photoshop.
Yeah.
The prosecution mentioned a deep fake, some other editing of the photograph. So you can see how this is, because I will introduce now, under the Public Official Election Act, we haven't actually stated what the statute is. If one of you could get it up for me, the actual statute, it is a quite extensive statute. Rudy, you will read it out if you would please do that for me, if you have it on hand.
I do. All right, so Article 250 of the Public Official Election Act in the Republic of Korea, Paragraph 2 says, any person who publishes or makes another person publish any false facts on a candidate, his or her spouse, lineal descendants, or siblings, so as to be unfavorable to the candidate through a speech, broadcast, newspaper, communication, magazine, poster, propaganda document, or other means with the intention of stopping the candidate from being elected, will be punished by imprisonment with prison labor for not more than 7 years or by a fine.
Yeah, so essentially, to summarize that, lying in a campaign to further your candidacy. And this related to the 2022, because this was in December of 2021. I believe this was before... Was this before the primary had been held in 2022?
This is before the primary.
It's during the campaign
Yeah.
of the 2022 presidential election. So it is not actually until a little bit before. I don't have it on hand when he's investigated. I will also mention there is a third statement for which Lee was indicted for, which regards the Dae Jang-dong development scandal, I believe. He made it during, I think it was a public hearing. I think it was a state audit. This is the October 20th statement.
Yeah.
He claimed that, I'm quoting here, the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport, which requested the change, threatened to make it an issue of dereliction of duty, so I had no choice but to comply. The key word there would be threatened. That was at issue a lot during the trial. And Lee does admit in the trial that perhaps I had, spoken a little bit rashly when I said threatened. But that he then claims that, pressured may have been a better word. So if you're lost in the semantics of this, so are the rest of us, and I think so is the rest of South Korea, which makes it, this is the case that that is the greatest threat to Lee, that will disqualify him, should his conviction be upheld. And I think I'd like to hear opinions on this, but what exactly is the value of having this sort of law if it can disqualify people for making off-the-cuff statements that may or may not be true? I can't see it, in my opinion. It really doesn't make sense to have a person disqualified over something like this.
Well, that's what I think is so unique about this case, because even in the other ideas that we were flagging for this podcast, it wasn't what the candidates in question had done wasn't actually to do with politics. For example, Marine Le Pen, she's under investigation, but it's about bank accounts and whether or not they're connected to Russia, stuff like that. That's not inherently political. This is inherently political, and so there's more of a direct connection between the judicial system and the political system. I can understand why they would want a law like that. I mean, and they do take it seriously. When the judge convicted Lee recently, he said that if political candidates are allowed to lie during elections, it can distort the will of the people, using very strong constitutional language when they're talking about it. And so and that does make sense. I would just say it's a bit naive, frankly, because politicians lie. It's in America, in England, in countries that I've kind of been more politically socialized in. It's kind of expected that politicians will bend the truth sometimes. And I think the reason that we don't take it that seriously when they do is that things like this happened, where you can have two main candidates who are disqualified because of judicial reasons, not because of political reasons.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I will say, well, in the case of Yoon, Korean presidents are limited to 1 5-year term. However, the criminal investigation, the investigation of Lee and the timing of it is deeply and explicitly intertwined with the case of Yoon, because the only reason that election is suspected to be going to be held is that once an impeachment of a president happens, there's a snap presidential election that constitutionally has to be held within 60 days after the impeachment. So the timing of this, which we'll get into later, is deeply tied with Yoon's case, even though Yoon is ineligible to run in 2027. If you want to chime in.
Well, I think the law is sort of a proactive policy for politicians. I mean, Korea is one of the highest politically radicalized countries currently, even higher than the U.S. And if you guys have seen the recent interview of Trump and Vance practically interrogating the Ukrainian President Zelensky with false facts said, such as America has basically invested over $300 million.
$300 billion.
$300 billion on Ukraine, and all Ukraine does is kill people.
Right.
Which they did not invest 300. I think it was approximately 250 with 40 billion from
it was
Europe.
And it ended up being less than what
lower.
Europe
So,
is.
would people want, just
But-
hypothetically, for Trump to be, tried under some sort of Public Official Election Act in the United States? I don't know.
Well, it would be a constitutional crisis. That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
Exactly. We talk about this, but then we know that some radical MAGA fans will be just taking that in like it's an inherent fact. It's like the truth because they said it. And it's the same for Korea, because Lee actually has a strong support in voters of their within like the 50s and the 60s, which make up actually a large population of Korea. And him saying these statements is practically a threat to the opposition party, but in this case, because it was during Moon's presidency, it was a threat to his own party practically.
Yes. Yep. I would say that, in the case of, if one could say that Donald Trump has fans, then Lee Jae-myung has fans. And there are some parallels between Trump and Lee, but we're not going to get into that. However, fandom politics is very much a thing in South Korea as well. You see it on the right wing in Korea, where you have, it seems that Yoon was enthralled by YouTube channels that were accusing the National Election Commission of holding data on servers that would prove election fraud by China and North Korea. They're using the Stop the Steal terms. But in the case of Lee, one can argue if it's as extreme, but he has a fan base of very rabid supporters, mainly, maybe not mainly, but a large portion of them are young women. I believe the term is dog girls that are given to them. There are some terms that they go by. We don't need to get into those. But he has a rabid fan base. In the case of when we'll get into political implications later. In the case of his arrest warrant being approved, because members of parliament have parliamentary immunity, when Lee's arrest warrant was approved by, I think, 1 or 2 votes in the National Assembly, people who were protesting outside almost tried to enter the National Assembly. Mm-hmm. It was getting close to a riot, essentially. The police had to come in and prevent them from entering. So it's a problem both on the right and the left. But in terms of, as it relates to criminal trials, it's the same thing you see in the U.S. and elsewhere. It's, disagreement over basic facts, very extreme measures taken to allow your candidate to win. And there's obviously allegations of the prosecution being used to take down political opponents. But I think it would probably be best if there are 4 other cases. We should touch on them at least a little bit because although a lot of them are complicated, as is the case of the Kim Moon-ki case, they pose less of a threat, but I think it would be helpful if we went through all of the trials that he went through. So the next case involves the Sangsang, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Sangbangor.
Thank you. And North Korea. Lee was charged in the Foreign Exchange Transaction Act, the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation Act, and the Aggravated Punishment Act. I don't believe that's too important on his own. The details of this case are essentially that Lee, in cooperation with his vice governor, the equivalent of the lieutenant governor in South Korea, used this underwear company, which is what SBW is, although they have expanded to other things, of funneling $8 million in U.S. dollars to North Korea. $5 million of those were used for the purposes of a farming project. The other $3 million was for the purposes of Lee planning this is what prosecutors claim, of Lee planning a solo trip to North Korea simply by himself, which could have been a big political coup, but a big political score for Lee, sort of showing himself to be a presidential-like candidate, and the liberals in South Korea favor a sort of rapprochement between South Korea and North Korea. Lee wants to, for example, open up tourism between the two countries again. So if either of you want to jump in on this one, this is a rather complicated one, and Lee's lieutenant governor was already convicted, I think, and faces 7 years in prison. Mm-hmm. So if either of you want to discuss that one.
Well, this is the case where it posed a risk to his next election, but he was able to wrap it up through also an important member of his, I guess, supporting body to get through this accusation. I mean, like the judgment I mentioned before, there is, again, a strong relevance to the case with Lee, yet he faces no legal risk within it, which makes the case really interesting because Lee is talked about in every part of how the case was taken, yet the blame is on someone else. Lee is not mentioned Lee is of course mentioned, but Lee does not take any blame. And so we sort of see Lee's having a tough time currently. He's coming up with all these court hearings and cases currently right before he can become this presidential candidate once more, and now he's forced. It seems like as if he's forced to blame it into his like inner circle just so that they can make this relevance. Of course, can't directly saying that because he was not actually accused of any of these crimes. Now he's not guilty of them, but that just seems to be the case for me.
Yeah. In this case, Lee's defense is essentially that SBW, the underwear company, had done these things without his approval. So I'm not quite sure if he's thrown his vice governor under the bus for it, but he basically said that this money that was funneled to North Korea happened without his say-so, without his knowledge, that these things just happened. That he didn't have any involvement in them, which this is a pretty serious charge. He could face up to, as you saw, his vice governor faces, I believe, 7 or 8 years in prison. This one he would. In all of these cases, essentially, the biggest threat that hangs over his head is if the sentence exceeds a certain amount of Korean won or a certain number of years, he is disqualified from running. That's another component of this that we haven't touched on, is that South Korea allows candidates to be barred from running, and this has happened to a lot of people over the years. I believe in the Kim Moon-gi case, he would be barred from the next presidential election. He might even be barred from the presidential election after that, which would be in like 2030.
And I believe he won't be able to run as a representative for the next decade.
That is also true. He would be stripped of his parliamentary seat. That also happened to another minor party candidate recently, Cho-gu,
Who's now in prison.
Who is now imprisoned. I think we'll touch upon him in a second. That sort of gets into the role of the prosecution.
I briefly mentioned about the Daejeong-dong case, but it's merged with Seongnam FC because of the similarity in crime, is it?
Yeah, the Seongnam FC case is an interesting case, which was merged, as you mentioned, with the Daejeong-dong development scandal, which is rather elaborate, but essentially accuses Lee of conspiring with a number of companies to allow, not Lee himself. The indictment actually doesn't state that Lee is the one that's raking in money for this. The prosecution claimed initially that they were going to be able to get Lee on charges of just bribery. It's a case of third-party bribery, which is that he has allowed other companies to profit due to these, maneuvers. That he's given them political favors through, in the case of Seongnam FC, through public-private partnerships. Essentially, that these companies would be allowed to advertise at the Seongnam FC, which is a soccer club, which is owned by the government, essentially. But Rudy, if you want to touch upon that case a little bit in regards to the nature of it, because in my opinion, it simply accuses Lee of good governance, of allowing companies to profit through public-private partnerships. Do you have a?
Yeah, it's very strange. I follow soccer. I have a decent understanding of I have a decent understanding of how this case played out. It all seems just very orthodox to me. It's extremely common for example, if the football club, the soccer club, as you want, was owned by a private company, which is actually most of the time how it is, it would be extremely common for the advertisements for it's common almost always to have front of shirt sponsors for soccer clubs. It's the only thing that's different is that it was owned by the government of I believe the city, right, of Seongnam.
Of the city of Seongnam, yes.
Yeah. Whether or not Lee charged a fair price for those sponsors, I guess, is a completely subjective view. It reminds me of other political cases where people, for example, will value properties incorrectly, but that's also different because in that case you would actually have to get proper appraisals. In this case, you don't need an appraisal; it's just business.
The reason why this case comes up is that we can sort of see this is during he was the mayor of Seongnam, right?
Yep.
And so we sort of see this as a build-up for him to be the governor of Gyeonggi-do, which is actually a more influential. it's about equivalent or maybe a little less influential than a minister in Korea, which gives him a lot of power rather than being a mayor. So I guess one important media framing that we need to know is was he, like you said, it's third. We sort of know that it's third party. What did you say again?
Third party bribery.
Third party bribery. But how did this play out after he became the governor of Gyeonggi-do?
Yeah. I think there are still two more cases after this. We will touch on those briefly and then move into the political implications of this. So the next case was a case which, as we've sort of mentioned a little bit, these cases some seem to overlap and tie into each other a little bit. In this case, I will read from an English language article here just so you get a sense of what's going on. Lee was accused of requesting false testimony from witness Kim Jin-sung during his trial for allegedly spreading false information under the Public Official Election Act, which has happened to him a few times. Lee, as a candidate for Gyeonggi-do governor, said during a televised debate in 2018 that he had been wrongly convicted in the early 2000s of impersonating a prosecutor. This statement is related to a 2002 case where Lee, then a lawyer, was fined 1.5 million won for impersonating a prosecutor while calling the then Seongnam mayor to gather information on an apartment project scandal alongside a KBS producer. So the prosecutorial impersonation case that I mentioned, it even mentions another case here that I don't think I actually touched on. He has faced trial in a number of cases. He has been threatened with facing trial in a number of cases. Mentioned briefly the case, I believe there was some speculation at the time when he was mayor of Gyeonggi-do that he would face charges for lying about his affair with this actress. I think it was, what was her name? Kim Boo's son. But there was accusations that he would face trial there. But I digress. In this case, this one, along with the Kim Moon-ki false facts case, are ones that have went to trial. There's essentially three really trials that happen, whether or not you are convicted or acquitted, because double jeopardy is a little bit different in South Korea than in the United States. In the case of what is perjury subornation, we might consider that witness intimidation, essentially telling a witness to say a certain thing during a trial. In this case, it was actually a few days after he was convicted in the Kim Moon-ki case, false facts case. He was acquitted in this case of the charges. I don't remember exactly what the judge had said about the case, but it was similar in the Kim Moon-ki case because, again, it was unclear as to whether or not, because the witness doesn't deny that Lee had contacted them. But it was unclear if Lee had really, again, it's a game of semantics, and it's unclear if Lee had really gotten this witness to lie or to pressure them to say a certain thing. I think Lee had told them to testify, but had not made any statement one way or the other that would be considered pressuring. So in this instance, he was actually acquitted. There are still appeals processes after being acquitted, which is not something that you would see in the United States. But I will now mention the last case, which I don't believe has gone to trial yet, over corporate credit card misuse or government credit card misuse. It charged Lee, the prosecution charged Lee, I think this was the most recent one that he was indicted under, with breach of duty, which is essentially the prosecution had accused Lee and his wife, although they did not indict his wife, of, if I remember correctly, they had accused Lee of using a government car as a personal car. I don't remember which car, so if you're into cars, I apologize. And also the fact that they had purchased meals and snacks for both themselves and for aides. It is probably the least threatening case to him in the order of it, but I think it was useful to mention all of them because as some have accused the prosecution and the PPP of targeting Lee, you can see the sort of range of severity of these crimes from, something akin to conspiring with a foreign government to, well, he spent a little bit too much on meals and sandwiches and he wrote them off as government expenses. So it really runs the gamut here. He's been accused of a lot of things. Now, since we've talked about it for so long, I hope to touch a little bit on the political implications. And I will start by noting the numerous delay tactics that Lee has used to try and get these trials pushed back. If either of you want to touch upon those delay tactics, be my guest. I have some of them listed, but you can, if either one of you would like to talk about those.
Well, I mean, his classic delay tactic would be practically to ask for a retrial again and again because
The appeals process.
practically, yeah, because so I believe it was the current Kim Moon-gi case itself is like I believe they're on the second process now, but he can still ask for an appeal process once more at the Supreme Court, which will be interesting if it actually does get to that phase. As now, then the question would be for the Supreme Court: would they make a judgment and use indictment first and then move on to Lee's case, or would they make their judgment simultaneously? Or actually, the last scenario could be that they make Yoon's indictment case first, but then also wrap up Lee's final appealing process within, I believe, the 60 days. The 60 days that the election must happen.
Yes.
Because if either of those cases happen, Lee does not get to have his position as a presidential candidate.
Yes. Do you want to touch upon it?
I mean, yeah, that's basically my understanding as well. I was curious about basically like, because I mean, what happened in America? It was a similar situation where
Yep.
one of the presidential candidates. I don't know if you heard.
We'll have an episode on that at some point.
Yeah, one of the presidential candidates, the one that won, Mr. Donald Trump, had a lot of cases, but he won. And
he was able to delay a lot of them.
Yeah, he was able to delay a lot of them until he won, and even the one that he couldn't delay, the one the one where he was convicted, the sentencing didn't happen until he won, and so basically nothing happened. All of the cases disappeared.
Yes.
So I wondered if it was a similar if it was a similar situation in South Korea.
I'm gonna touch on that right after. I would say about the delay tactics. He's used a number of them. The appeals is the most obvious one. He can even you can take up to, for example, on small things which will matter in the coming months. You can take up to 7 days to file an appeal, so you can just go out the full 7 days and the 7th day file your appeal. That's a week that's written off there. When you change venues or you move from trial to trial, there's a question of receipts of the actual documents, the court documents that are required for a given trial. Have to be delivered to all relevant parties, and that includes the presidential candidate. That includes Lee. So in past cases, Lee has avoided receiving these documents. You get, like, generally, there's 3 opportunities for the court to go and send out documents. Lee will claim that he's changed addresses. He will claim that the work, he's used this frequently, that my work in the National Assembly as a leader of the party, of the Democratic Party, and as leader, just as a member of the National Assembly, I have a whole bunch of work to do. I can't receive these documents. So the court has an option of simply, in one instance, a bailiff literally delivered the papers to his home, or they can post the documents online. Lee has attempted on multiple occasions in these trials to get judges recused. That can drag it out a bit longer. In one instance, I believe in the Kim Moon-gi case, he filed a constitutional appeal, which is essentially to tell the Constitutional Court, which is different from the Supreme Court in South Korea, to adjudicate and say, well, is this law constitutional? Can we uphold this portion, which they have, of the Public Official Election Act, sometimes different clauses, but they have upheld the Public Official Election Act as constitutional. So that was another way that Lee tried to. He's tried to get trials moved. In the case of the SBW case, he claimed that there would be a problem of presumption of innocence if he was tried in the same court as the court that convicted his vice governor. So this segues naturally into the political implications. The timing of the trial is obviously very important. In the Kim Moon-gi case, he's got his 3 trials. The first one he was convicted of. The second one, the last hearing was held just a few days ago, and a ruling will be made on March the 26th.
Yep.
Now, as it stands, Yoon's impeachment trial, which is the whole thing that can allow an early presidential election to happen, is scheduled to wrap up around mid-March. That will then leave 60 days for a presidential election. You do the math, that leaves mid-May. If you do the math on the Kim Moon-gi case, it should, under the principles of 633, which is a legal principle in South Korea for the Public Official Election Act, it should take 6 months for the first trial, 3 months for the second trial, 3 months for the third trial, the appeals, essentially. That has not been followed in, I think, all of Lee's cases. It's not a hard and fast. It is written in law, but a lot of times you're just able to extend it for extenuating circumstances, or for, in Lee's case, which are quite brazenly, attempting to delay a trial intentionally. So he has about a month's period here where he can work with. Now that depends on Yoon's trial actually ending in mid-March. There was just a dispute between the acting president, Choi Sang-mok, over the appointment of a ninth justice to the Supreme Court. If that justice were to be appointed by Choi, that could possibly delay Yoon's impeachment trial a little bit in the Constitutional Court, which could hypothetically buy a little bit of time, or shorten the amount of time for Lee, buy a little bit of time for the People Power Party, who's the conservative opposition party, to so that Lee would be able to, so the presidential election is delayed by a little bit, and therefore Lee would be convicted. The Supreme Court could also step in and decide to speed up the trial, which they do have that option of doing. Their reputation has been under assault recently. It would probably harm it even more if they did do that, decided to speed up the trial. A lot of it has to do with, as we were talking about before, the receipts of court documents being read out. The Supreme Court ruled recently they were able to truncate this period of these receipts and would only read out relevant portions or key portions of material from each trial. That would take months, so it would shorten it by a little bit. But still, it's a period about a month for Lee. Most people suspect that Lee will be able to hang on, essentially to have Yoon's impeachment upheld, which the majority, I think most people would say that Yoon's impeachment trial will be upheld. His impeachment will be upheld, not dismissed. That will cause a presidential election, and Lee is the heavy favorite in this presidential election. He would win, and then there's another legal problem for him, and it's involved in Article 84 of the Constitution. Would either of you like to make any sort of statement about Article 84? Because it is very important for this case. Neither of you know about Article 84. Well, Article 84 of the South Korean Constitution says that a president cannot be prosecuted except for cases of treason and insurrection. Because I think that's what made Yoon lose his presidential immunity.
Well, insurrection sort of counts within treason.
Yeah.
In this case, so treason is actually the only crime a president can be accused of.
Okay. So there's considerable debate among legal scholars, and Lee weighed in, could Lee just dismiss all of these trials? And would he have the constitutional right to dismiss them under Article 84, which states that the president cannot be tried? There's some disagreement because, well, first of all, there's no precedent for this. There was sort of a half precedent in 2007 when Lee Jae-myung was elected. There were some consideration of charges which had been formally put down for Lee, Lee Jae-myung. The opposition parties had called for indictments. They were never handed down, essentially under the principle that a president shouldn't be charged. But in this case, Lee has been convicted already of a crime. So, it gets into a debate. And this is also a debate in the United States, should a president be charged for crimes while in office?
Well, legally, no. I mean,
we're looking for opinions.
I believe that the only reason why the only crime that a president can be charged with is due to the importance of their role in the political structure. In Korea at least, there is quite a bit of concentration of power in presidency, which means that if there is any problems of that power, practically the whole Korean politics will be. It will like the whole scene will rupture. So that's the only reason why we mandate treason to be the only crime. But from the recent years, we've seen that crime happen quite frequently within presidents, and so it still has to be. It's. I believe it's a very important article that still has to be upheld.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Rudy?
I mean, yeah, it makes sense. There are similar concepts in American politics as well. I mean, just recently there was a Supreme Court decision that protected the president from basically any from prosecution over any activities related to his official duties, which is quite broad. It makes sense to me. It's just specifically for Lee, it's about. I don't know. It puts kind of the letter of the law against the spirit of the law, because it's meant to protect actions that the president's doing, but I guess it could be used via the letter of the law to protect actions that the president did before he was president, but now he has the immunity of the president. It's a mixture of the kind of the underlying concept and actually how the law is enforced, which. I'm not sure. To be honest, I'm not sure how it will be.
Well, I mean, when this article was, I guess, first amended, I don't believe there were any politicians who thought that there could be any presidential candidates, even regards to the fact that they have previous criminal records, could become a president. But in our recent years, as we've seen, the world politics have been getting very radicalized, and that fact has not. It did not like the criminal records did not matter to people anymore. It was whether our party gets voted in or they're voted out.
Yep.
And because of this severe division in politics, it's been started to be abused by people like Trump, and Lee could possibly be abusing it.
You could. Negative polarization would be the term in regards to these criminal trials. Is that there doesn't seem to be agreement on, it's all turning into division by party. It's sort of, to borrow a quote from the Simpsons. It's one of, I think it's Krusty the Clown, and he's voting for either Sideshow Bob or for Joe Quimby, and he says about Sideshow Bob, well, he framed me for armed robbery, but I'm aching for that upper class tax cut. People just don't really care about it anymore. But what we haven't really discussed is, do the voters care about it? Now, within the Democratic Party, Lee's position has been pretty secure recently. However, he was elected to, I believe, as leader of the party officially in August 2022, which, mind you, was after he lost the election. His position has been sort of a bit turbulent. He's had his detractors in the party. Detractors such as, I think, Lee Jae-myung, who formed his own party to try and ensure that Lee would lose, though he really hasn't gained any traction with that. But his position was consolidated in April 2024 when there were parliamentary elections that were held. One, because of the fact that Lee was able to win that election pretty resoundingly. They didn't get a 2/3 majority, which would have been able to override Yoon's veto. However, him and the other opposition parties secured a comfortable majority of probably 60-some-odd% of the seats, 65% of the seats. However, in that election as well, in the primary process, Lee had pushed out through his influence over the nomination process, because I'll digress here for a second. The nomination process, the primary process in South Korea, is much different than it is in the United States. In the United States, it's fairly simple. One area why I will praise the United States and its election laws is for the primary system. Is it's simply you vote on the candidates. It's usually first past the post between 3 or 4 different candidates. Whoever has the most votes wins. In South Korea, they don't have direct voting in primaries. It's a whole range of different factors that they consider: opinion polls, loyalty to the candidate or to the party.
Who eventually makes the call about what candidate gets to run, though?
You might know that better than I do. I think it's the president. They can not the president, I mean the leader of the party. I mean, in Yoon's case, Yoon was facing some legal troubles himself besides the martial law declaration over supposedly conspiring, him and his wife conspiring with a pollster to publish opinion polls that were favorable to his preferred candidates. And through the publishing of these opinion polls, these would help the candidates in the primary process because it's like 5 or 6 different factors they consider, and they don't hold direct primaries. But basically, after that digression, Lee was able to push out a lot of these candidates who had opposed him, who were very worried about his criminal trials, and in a more pro-Lee faction. So after that, and the martial law declaration was actually quite fortuitous for Lee because of all the trials that he's been facing, and if he was disqualified in any of them, that would be it. If you're disqualified, you're done. And I would put forth the example of rebuilding Korea Party leader Cho, how do you pronounce it, Cho-gu? Cho-guk. He was staunchly opposed to the dictatorship of the prosecution, as he had called it, and he was the Minister of Justice in 2020 when they were trying to push through prosecutorial reform under the Moon Jae-in administration. Yoon was not so happy with that when he was head prosecutor. And the right-wing media had sort of ginned up charges that Cho and his wife had sort of falsified documents to allow their daughter to get into college.
MIT.
Yeah. Very prestigious American university. For that, Cho was just, I think in December, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction in that case, and Cho was barred from running. He's in prison right now.
Is he in prison for, was it 3 years?
I'm not exactly sure. 3 years might be it. But that also gets to the fact of the presidential election itself. In the polling, before you do direct head-to-head, because they have basically direct primary systems that are akin to the U.S. for the presidential elections, Lee leads by quite a lot. He usually polls at about 35 to 40%, and the PPP hasn't really decided on a candidate, at least not yet. If you poll head-to-head against certain other candidates, Kim Moon-soo, was it the mayor of Daegu, Oh-se-hoon? Hung Jung-pyo, okay, sorry. There's another mayor as well. But he leads in the head-to-heads and in the full field questions. So it is the thinking that Lee should win. The PPP has recovered in the polls recently due to a rallying around their leader because of his arrest, Yoon, because of his arrest and imprisonment.
And you see a lot of young voters rallying around the PPP party too, which is interesting because now we see this, I guess, a generational divide. Mm-hmm. And
that's been a problem for a while in South Korean politics, but a little bit recently with young voters, young men and young women. Mm-hmm.
I'm really not sure how this will end up if Lee does get disqualified. I mean, we see a generational divide here. Then, like the older generation, the 50s, 60s, 70s. Who do you think they will vote for? Would they be willing to turn around for the young, I believe Kim Jung-suk, who will be turning 40 before the next?
Just to add context, he's a minor party candidate who was used to be leader of the PPP, mm-hmm. the parliamentary leader, who was involved in this sort of manosphere. I think he was a very anti-feminist guy. But he has formed his own minor party. He's polling at about 1 or 2%.
Yeah. And he does hold similar perspectives to Lee, which could be a selling point if Lee does get disqualified for those voters who actually went for him because of his policies. Mm-hmm. Or do you believe that they will go for someone more like Hong Jun-pyo, who's also still a conservative, but
he's ran like 2 or 3 different times, right?
Yeah, he ran 2 or 3 different times, and he's like a major player in the Korean political scene. And so I think generally what I'm trying to say is like if Lee does get disqualified, I think there's going to be a huge chaos.
A lot of chaos. We'll talk about that in a second.
With who you have to vote for, because I guess there is no more of these like landmark politicians that we can think of.
Yeah. I would say that as we're talking about the consolidation within the party, there has been some unease in the party over his trials. You saw it in 2023 when there was considerable debate and pushing by members of the PPP that Lee should revoke, we mentioned it before, revoke his parliamentary immunity, which you are given parliamentary immunity. I'm not sure what the scope of the parliamentary immunity is, but they called it his bulletproof vest, that he'd been able to use that to prevent himself from being charged. The reason why he's been charged in all these things is he gave up his parliamentary immunity. And the vote to hand down an arrest warrant in I don't remember what case where he was handed down for this arrest warrant. They had to vote on it to hand down an arrest warrant. And the first vote, which I believe in February of 2023, failed, although there were a number of members of his party, since the National Assembly has anonymous voting, there were a number of members of the DPK, parliamentarians, who voted to uphold the arrest warrant. And in August of 2023, while Lee was staging a hunger strike, which many believed was a cynical ploy to prevent him from to generate sympathy within the party, there were something like 30 or 40 members of the DPK who voted to uphold the arrest warrant. And that was considered a major crisis in Lee's leadership. He was able to weather the storm, but if Lee were to be convicted in this second trial in the Kim Moon-gi case, which is the most relevant one, there is some discussion that some well-known members of the party, for example, the two that I have listed here, Kim Dong-yeon, who I think is the mayor or is the governor of, who was in Lee's post, Gyeonggi-do, and Kim Kyung-soo, who was recently, what was he? Kim Kyung-soo, was he the mayor? Was he the governor of, I don't remember his position exactly. But he ran into some legal trouble. However, he was pardoned by President Yoon because he was considered to be a sort of stalking horse within the party who would be able to be a leadership rival to Lee. There are some other candidates. However, if you look at the polls when they ask about all of these people, Lee gets something like 80% of the primary vote. There's really a perception that Lee Jae-myung is the Democratic Party. If he is eliminated, it's total chaos. No one knows who would take his place. It would be totally thrown open. It's unlikely that he will be disqualified, as we've discussed, but it would completely throw the race wide open, and all of your prognostications are phooey. They're not going to be of any help to you.
Just to fill in the gap with how Lee would be getting a bulletproof vest was
Thank you.
that was a statement said by the PPP after the Seongnam FC case, which we talked about briefly before. It was basically that the court has asked the prosecutor to leave the court during the courting process, which meant that if this was to leave as a president, then on all the cases following relevant to Lee could be asking for the prosecutor to leave the court, which is only going to leave a one-sided argument for the judge to hear upon, which basically he has a lot of hearings going on currently. It would give him this immunity because they're only going to be looking at one side and Lee's perspective on the event.
Okay, so I want to close by sort of tying these things together with a few themes. We've gone over a lot, but the power of the prosecution is really a big theme in Lee's cases and with really the trials of politicians in general in South Korea. Rudy, if you could touch on a little bit the power that the prosecution has in South Korea compared to other countries, because it's quite extensive compared to the United States.
Yeah, so my understanding is that they just have a good degree of I guess of independence from the police. They direct a lot. Yeah, they direct a lot of what the police do. It's a bit. What I've read went into quite a good bit of detail, but basically in other countries, it's the police who make more of the decisions about what cases to take, whether or not they believe that the law may have been broken, stuff like that. Whereas in this case, in South Korea's case, it's the prosecution who makes a lot more of those calls, and as a result, it's the prosecution gets to have a lot of influence on politics, like in this case. Whereas in other cases, it would kind of more be in other countries, it would more be the police of the police going after making these calls. Instead, it's the prosecution who have more of a, I would say, connection to other parts of government as opposed to it just being, their jobs.
Yeah, and I think what's really important to mention is essentially there's a central prosecutor's office, which is not something that you see in the United States. We frequently reference the United States because we are from the United States. But the fact that the prosecution is central and answers to the justice minister, right? Not the president directly, but to the minister of justice. However, the justice minister is, of course, appointed by the president and confirmed by the National Assembly. So there have been accusations, which is really the whole reason why you see these sort of tit-for-tat trials of presidents, whether it's it started out with the military dictator in the 80s, Chun Doo-hwan, who ended up facing treason and was going to face the death penalty before a sentence was commuted, as well as the President Roh Tae-woo, who was the first president under democratization in 1987. So since then, it's been with almost every president, they faced some sort of investigation. And Roh Tae-woo ended up jumping off of a cliff due to investigations that many now believe were essentially fabricated against him. Lee Myung-bak was convicted for, I think, corruption. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah.
It's not particularly important. Park Geun-hye was rather famously internationally, she ended her term with a 4% approval rating, was convicted, was impeached and convicted and sentenced to prison for undue influence that an advisor of hers had. I think there was a kickback scheme, a whole lot of things. There is also a trend of presidents being pardoned by whether the next president or a few presidents afterwards. Moon Jae-in, who has himself become the target of some investigations now by the Yoon administration, although it's not been quite to the same extent as other presidents, pardoned Park. And then there's obviously the connection that Yoon has with this whole thing. Yoon was the supreme prosecutor. He was actually appointed under the Moon administration before he sort of had his politics were really that well known, but he started out as a lawyer, as a prosecutor. And Yoon, was the chief prosecutor when Park was impeached. He argued that case. Now, of course, he is elected. He is now facing an impeachment trial himself for a declaration of martial law, which is actually, the funny thing about that martial law declaration is it is in the Constitution. You are allowed to declare martial law. You have to have some very explicit reasons for it, reasons which Yoon is trying to argue were valid. I don't think that they are valid, if you want my own opinion. But essentially, the power of the prosecution, which did start under the authoritarian period, has been a source of outcry among the Korean public, or at least the liberal Korean public. During the Moon Jae-in administration, he was elected on a promise to sort of clean up government because of the immense corruption that had occurred under the Park Geun-hye governments and the Lee Myung-bak governments. So he undertook prosecution reform, and he established this office, the CIO, the Corruption Investigation Office, which helped to arrest Yoon. A lot of those forms ended up being curtailed for one reason or another. Cho was the justice minister. Cho Guk was the justice minister who was supposed to undertake all of this, but he ended up himself in a scandal, which sort of made him into into a hypocrite. Whether or not you believe that those trials were legitimate, they were promoted by the right-wing press and newspapers. But essentially, all of this is to say has South Korean politics become too judicialized? Is it just going after tit-for-tat candidates for fabricated reasons, for minor technical violations? We've been talking about this the whole time, but is South Korean politics too judicialized?
I mean, I think that's kind of I think that's kind of been made evident just by exactly what we've been
Yeah.
talking about today.
Ask you sort of
But
a
the
softball.
yeah, but the I guess a more interesting question is I guess why it I guess one because we do have laws of the same ilk in other countries.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't have the same number of instances of them coming into play to such a degree. We had it in the last election with Trump.
Sure.
The mayor of New York, Eric Adams, had problems with that. Rob Menendez from New Jersey, a senator from New Jersey, had stuff like that. So there are cases, but they're just not as common, and they don't seem to be as politically critical as they are in South Korea. One explanation that for that I could give is, maybe South Korean politicians are just less scrupulous. Probably not the case.
Yeah.
It's probably an institutional thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a more productive question to ask. We talked about the independence of the prosecution. That's one thing, and then we've also talked about the peculiarity of some of these laws, specifically the elections law, where you're not allowed to lie.
Not allowed to lie. If you propose that sort of law in the United States, it would be dead on arrival. It's a
Exactly.
major difference.
Exactly. And so that's I think that's what I would be interested in going forward in South Korea. Like how does the South Korean government, the South Korean courts, South Korean people react to these laws? Do they seem to have accepted their existence, at least, maybe not the way that they're enforced, and again, that is probably has a lot to do with polarization. So,
Well, I mean, it's interesting that people think that Korean politics has just been judicialized because of all these, like the martial law and the recent unveiling of all these cases. And I sort of get why, because in America, when we first think of Korea, right, I guess the first time you guys heard of Korea was like in 2018, 2019 with so you guys heard, so it started with K-pop. Okay, what is K-pop? We go into like these, there's this really nice girl group called Blackpink, and then we see this whole boom come up with BTS, which is followed by like all these Korean foods. And we see Korea in a very cultural perspective.
it's the K-pop to political fraud pipeline.
Exactly.
People don't
Exactly.
talk about it.
And then on the recent unveilings, so followed by BTS is impeachment, martial law. And then we hear like these 24 cases of impeachment have been filed with it for high elite positions in Korea within only the last year.
Quickly, that's been an accusation that Yoon has put forth. That the Democratic Party is attempted to impeach. It's not he's accusing them, but it's absolutely true that they've attempted to impeach a whole number of ministers. They even impeached the acting president, Han Duck-soo, who was the prime minister. They've tried to been dismissing Han for a while, but it's been a problem. They've been trying to the Democratic Party has been going after all of these people, and Yoon claimed that it paralyzed state affairs.
Exactly. I know. If you think why it has been so judicialized, we can connect it back to the start of the Democratic Party, which it leads back to the important events of the 1980s in Korea, especially the July. Yeah, I believe it was the July Democratic Uprising, which basically brings the sixth regime and it ends the dictatorship in Korea. But then we see the current politicians who are they were the main members of this democratic uprising, like Lee, who are basically breaching the own laws that they have upheld for decades.
Yep.
To be the president of this nation. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really an interesting trend that we see, because it's like the politicians back then would have never guessed that their own, I guess, they're younger politicians who should be having the same ideology as them, is breaching their own ideology for power.
Okay, so I would like to finish off by just, if we could all, maybe we can make this a tradition throughout the podcast, but just make some predictions as to what we think is going to happen here. I'm going to take the opinion that I think most people would take, is that Lee will be able to skirt the trials. if we saw in the United States, if there was a question of, the president has been a convicted felon, what would happen? The judge in that New York case just said, we're going to unconditionally release you. You will have the record of a felon, but you won't be able to. It won't impact your ability to serve as president. In this instance, I really don't think the Supreme Court is going to step in and say, no, the Article 84, because there is going to be some sort of interpretation that is handed down in a case at some point over Article 84 of the Constitution. And essentially, I think they're going to say, no, Lee's going to be allowed to serve as president. He already has, he's going to have trust problems if he gets in. But anyways, he will win the election, however convincingly. He will be able to skirt the trials. He will have a parliament that is pretty pliable, that supports him. So he won't have legal problems maybe to start, but after he's president, all bets are off.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I think after he leaves the presidency, if he's able to skirt the trials and then wins, he's probably going to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors.
I'll take a little different path here.
Terrific.
I think the Supreme Court should be able to get Yoon impeached.
Upheld.
And the impeachment upheld.
Okay.
And simultaneously be able to find Lee guilty within the 60 days that the campaign has to go on.
It's a bold take.
And it's a very much of an optimistic view, but the current policies that Lee hopes to bring to Korea are very populist.
Yes.
And
we didn't touch upon that.
Yeah, we didn't touch upon that, but and they seem to change every time depending on how he can make those policies look charming to the public.
He's called himself a pragmatist.
Exactly.
Or even a conservative party, the Democratic Party.
But from how I view it is that he's practically putting interest on the younger generation. And that is a problem that Koreans will have to fix now or later. And so, on my perspective, it would be better, I guess, if we put it in a very messy view. It's like we gotta drain some blood here. Like some of them decide to clog our nation, and so it's time to drain some blood and bring in some fresh, new politicians that can actually
not shed blood.
Drain blood.
Yeah,
okay. Drain blood.
Glad that no blood was shed.
We're not shedding any more blood. I think we did that enough in the 70s and the 80s. And I mean, this is a very, I guess, important time for Korea. There could be another paradigm shift, possibly like the 80s, but it's a very slight chance. Like I said, it's not. This is a very minority view, and this is a very optimistic, focused view. So we'll have to see how the Supreme Court will be landing on this, and eventually how the people will react to it, because politics in Korea is very relevant to legal problems, but also how the people react.
So that wraps up our pilot episode. Next time, trial of Marine Le Pen, maybe. We've also been throwing around Benjamin Netanyahu. There will be an episode on Trump at some point. That will be very exciting for the rest of us. But we will see, and that is all.